After a quarter of a century, everything in her pointed to God, forgetting about his promise to her and her husband. Her body had left her helpless, and God's silence had left her hopeless. To say that she had been wrestling with her faith in God's promises would be an understatement. As we saw yesterday, God had promised Abraham and Sarah that he would make them into a great nation, which means they would have at least one child to continue the family lineage. But 25 years had gone by since that promise, and Sarah had grown to be a bit bitter towards God's long-lost promise to her. But then, God appears. It was a hot day, one that causes you to just sit down and roast. Abraham and Sarah didn't have air conditioning, so they just had to deal with the heat. As Abraham is sitting in the doorway of his tent, he looks up and he notices 3 men standing in front of him. He immediately gets up, runs to them, bows down to them, and calls them Yahweh. Now let's pause. To call someone Yahweh was blasphemous, unless the person receiving the label was, in fact, God. So we know that Abraham wouldn't flippantly throw that label around like he would with bro or dude. I think it would be cool if he used these words, don't you? So we see what's happening here is that God actually appears to Abraham in and through these 3 men. The theological term is Theophany, which simply means God appearance. So let's keep this in mind as we continue. Now let's get back to the story. Abraham urges the 3 men, who we understand now to be God, to stay and hang out with him. They agree, and Abraham begins mobilizing his group to prepare food for the men, to bring them water to clean up from their journey, and to bring milk for them to drink. He seems like quite the host. At this point, word seems to have gotten around, at least to Sarah, that these guests weren't just any ordinary guests. So she begins listening to the conversation that is taking place between them and Abraham outside of her tent. This is what she hears. They said to him, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" And he said, "Well, she's in the tent." And the Lord said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son." Genesis 18:9-10. As Sarah hears these words spoken by these 3 men, her physical reality becomes overwhelmingly loud to her. She had gone through menopause and was past the point of being able to have children. All signs in her pointed to her never being able to hold her own child. She'd given up on seeing God's promise manifest into reality, and she'd grown bitter. She had grown cynical, and she was a mess of emotions. And this was her reaction to what she had heard. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" Genesis 18:12. She doubted to the point of laughing in the face of God's promise. Did she know that these 3 men were a theophany? Remember, that's a God appearance. No, but that doesn't change what she did. In the face of God giving Abraham and her a clear promise, with a due date this time, Sarah laughed at the thought as if it were a joke. Sarah had dealt with disappointment for long enough that her heart was calloused to the promises of God. Day after day of hope and despair, and on, took a toll on her, and she had grown so used to being disappointed that the thought of God delivering the goods was simply laughable. Certainly, she's not the only one. There are seasons in our lives, sometimes 25 years long, that cause us to become callous to the thought that God still cares for us, that He will, in fact, deliver on His promises. Maybe for you, it's the pain of relationships. You've been burned too many times to count, and you're at the point where you have closed yourself off to others. Your callous protects you, but hinders you at the same time. You find it laughable to think that you could find true friendship again. Maybe for you, it's the pain of bad health. You've been through the ringer with diagnosis after diagnosis, and you've gone through treatment and things still return. Aching pains never leave you, and you wonder if God is such a great physician, why is He letting you go through this? Or maybe for you, it's the pain of God saying no to your prayers. You've gone to Him in faith time after time, but it seems that every time you do, you've been returned a rejection letter, and you've reached the point where you don't bother praying anymore. You'd rather save yourself from the pain of hearing no once again. Pain creates calluses, and those calluses can cause us to do really dumb things, like laugh at God. As God always does, He delivered on His promise to Sarah and Abraham. She became pregnant despite the fact that she was past menopause, and she had that baby boy just like God had said. In response, Sarah exclaimed, "God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me." And she said, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." Genesis 21, 6-7. In the end, Sarah flipped the script of her story. She began the scene by laughing at God, but she ended it by essentially calling herself the laughingstock. God will do that with our pain. Just when we think we've had enough, He'll show us the purpose in our pain. It is through our pain that we begin to see God's hand at work in a vibrant way. See Romans 5. In all this, Sarah's pain wasn't the main character. God was. His faithfulness is shown to be perfect, even when we doubt it. Sarah let her calluses become her mess, but God had the last laugh in all this. He cleaned her up and removed her doubt by delivering on what He had told them 25 years prior. It may take some time, but God will always deliver on what He says He will do.